Tonight's story is about a 911 call that lasted 47 seconds. And what investigators found at the end of the call was so disturbing that the recording was sealed from the public for years. In November of 2014, a 32-year-old paramedic named Daniel Harper rented a small cabin just outside a rural mountain town for what he told his coworkers would be a quiet 3-day break from the chaos of emergency work. And the cabin itself sat at the very end of a dirt road, surrounded on all sides by dense pine forests that locals described as too quiet. But Daniel was not superstitious. He's seen real trauma, real fear, real death. So a silent forest didn't bother him. He arrived just before sunset, texted his sister a photo of the cabin with the caption, "Off-grid recharge mode." And then his phone went dark, because there was no service out there, but the cabin did have a landline, an old beige phone mounted to the kitchen wall that the owner insisted was just in case. The first night passed without incident, but the next evening, around 10:30 p.m., Daniel placed a call to 911 from the landline. The dispatcher who answered would later testify that Daniel did not sound drunk, hysterical, or confused. He sounded controlled, but terrified. He told the dispatcher someone was walking around his cabin, slowly and deliberately circling it. When asked if he could see the person, he said no, but he could hear the crunch of boots in the gravel, stopping directly outside whatever window he was closest to, as if whoever was out there knew exactly where he was standing inside. The dispatcher told him to lock the doors and stay on the line. Daniel replied in a steady whisper, "They're already locked. I checked twice." For several seconds, there was only the faint sound of his breathing and the distant creaking of wood. And then he said something that changed the entire tone of the call. He said, "They just knocked. But not on the door. It's on the wall. Like they're testing it." The dispatcher asked if he owned any weapons, and Daniel said there was a fireplace poker in the living room. You could hear him pick it up, the faint scrape of metal against the brick, and then suddenly 3 loud bangs echoed through the receiver. Not on the door, not on a window, but from somewhere deeper in the cabin. Daniel froze. The dispatcher asked what that was, and after a long pause he whispered, "That was inside." At that point, the dispatcher began urgently telling him to leave immediately, to get into his car, but Daniel said he couldn't, because his car keys were missing. And he was absolutely certain he had left them on the kitchen counter. Then faintly, over the line, you can hear what sounds like a slow, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the wooden floor in another room. Daniel's breathing becomes uneven, and he says, "There's no attic. There's no basement. There's nowhere to be up there." The dispatcher asks what he means, and Daniel replies, "The footsteps. They're above me." What makes this detail so chilling is that the cabin's blueprints later confirmed there was no second floor, just a single level, with a crawl space barely tall enough for wiring. Daniel then begins moving through the cabin. You can hear floorboards creaking as he whispers that he's just going to check the hallway. Suddenly he stops mid-step and says very clearly, "I see him." The dispatcher immediately asks who he sees, but Daniel doesn't answer right away. And when he finally does, his voice is strained and confused. He says, "It looks like me." 3 full seconds, silence. And then the line fills with a sharp crackling sound, like wood splintering, followed by Daniel shouting something unintelligible before the call abruptly cuts out. Deputies were dispatched immediately, but the cabin was nearly 25 minutes from the nearest station, and when they arrived, the front door was wide open, the lights were all still on, and the landline receiver was dangling by its cord, gently swinging as if it had just been dropped. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no footprints in the mud outside except for Daniel's from earlier that evening. Inside, however, the cabin looked as though a struggle had taken place. The kitchen table was overturned, a chair lay splintered against the wall, and deep gouge marks scored the hardwood floors in a straight line from the hallway to the living room. The fireplace poker was found bent at a sharp angle, as though it had been twisted with extreme force. Daniel was nowhere to be found. Search teams combed the forest for days using dogs, thermal drones, and helicopters, but there was no trace of him. No blood trail, no clothing, no body. What they did find, though, was Daniel's car, parked exactly where he left it. His keys were discovered inside the locked cabin, sitting neatly on the kitchen counter where he swore they had been before. Investigators initially suspected a mental break, perhaps brought on by the stress. But Daniel had no history of psychiatric illness, no use of drugs or alcohol in his system according to medical records from a recent work physical, and his coworkers described him as level-headed under pressure. The most unsettling detail emerges weeks later when a forensic audio specialist reviews the 911 recording using enhanced software, isolating background noises that wasn't obvious during the original call. Beneath Daniel's voice, at an extremely low volume, was another voice, faint, distorted, but synchronized almost perfectly with his speech, as if repeating him only a half-second later. When Daniel whispered they're outside, the second voice echoed, outside, but deeper, warped, and slightly delayed. When he said, I see him, the second voice said, see him. And just before the line cut out, when Daniel began to scream, the second voice didn't echo. It laughed. The cabin owner, who had rented the property for over a decade, later admitted that 2 previous tenants had broken their leases early, claiming they heard someone walking in the crawl space at night. But inspections had never revealed anything unusual. After Daniel's disappearance, the cabin was demolished, the foundation torn, and nothing was discovered beneath it. Nothing but dirt and stone. To this day, the case remains unsolved, and the official reports list Daniel Hopper as a missing persons presumed dead. Though no cause of death was ever determined, the 911 recording was eventually released through a records request, heavily redacted, but the final 7 seconds remain classified, and according to one deputy who heard the unedited version, those last seconds contain a sound that does not belong to any animal, any machine, or any human. Daniel went to the mountains for peace and isolation, a brief escape from the horrors he witnesses in his job. But instead, something found him in a place with no neighbors, no witnesses, and no way out. And whether it was a person, a psychological break, or something far stranger, one fact remains. Whatever was in the cabin that night did not leave tracks, did not leave DNA, and did not leave Daniel behind.